So I want to thank everyone for joining today. This is going to be, I think this is really the second webinar in our home lab series. We had one a couple weeks ago with Jarian Gibson, Stephen Wagner, and I, where we talked about just home lab stuff in general. So today we're going to take this a little bit different, in a little bit different of a direction. And we are going to talk about my particular home lab journey. So for those of you who don't know me, my name's Sean Massey. I am one of the board members for World of EUC, and I've been on the board since our founding and kind of coming out of stealth mode last year. Now, in theory, I am a self-employed consultant. I have my own company called Virtual Horizon Consulting. Prior to that, I was at VMware until that whole Broadcom thing happened, where I did what I call cloudy EUC things. I sat at that kind of intersection between all the cool cloud stuff and cloud provider stuff that VMware was doing and the EUC space. I'm a VCDX. I'm a blogger. For all my socials, GitHub, and all that stuff, I have a Linktree page at seanmassey.net, which you can go to find all that. So I want to kind of start this off with a little bit of level setting, because typically when people talk about home labs, whether they're writing about them or they're presenting about them, it's really more about the hardware that they have. I'm not going to talk about the hardware in my lab today. This is going to be a story about how my home lab journey and my career journey kind of go together and how they align. Now, I'm not going to talk about hardware for a couple of reasons. First off, I don't think that's really the most important discussion point when it comes to talking about home labs these days. Hardware is hardware. Everybody has different use cases. Everybody has different constraints and requirements that go into how they build and design their lab and what they use. And the hardware you pick is kind of, shaped by all of that. Now, I will mention some things about hardware when it's relevant, when it adds to capabilities, or there's like a historical, perspective on why I pick something or whatnot. But really, hardware is hardware, right? The vendor doesn't matter. What you pick doesn't matter. It's all just hardware. Now, there is another reason I didn't put on the slide for this. Also, back at VMworld 2023, I actually did an official VMworld session on home labs. And my speaking partner spent, I want to say, like 15 minutes and like 10 slides going over line by line what hardware he had and why he did it. And that just doesn't feel like the best use of time to me. But kind of getting back to this last bullet point, right? Like hardware is hardware. Well, for those of you who remember the movie Armageddon, right? It's all the same stuff, right? It's all sheet metal and PCBs if you're using servers, or, PCBs and plastic cases if you're using things like NUCs. It doesn't matter who makes it, because in the end, it's probably all made in the same factory. So if you do want to know more about hardware or how, like the underlying architecture of my lab has evolved, I have done a number of home lab blog posts. The QR code on the screen will take you to a page on my blog that just like the home lab category. It lists all the posts that I've done on it. So you can kind of track the evolution there, if you want to see something specific about the hardware. If you do have questions about that, feel free to drop them into chat. I have no problem talking about it. I just don't want to make that the main focus of this talk. So with that, one last thing is I have also done another VMworld presentation. This was a vBrownBag one, where I talk about making the most of your home lab. A lot of the same type of content, but that is up on YouTube. The QR code that is now up on screen will also take you to that video. And that's just kind of a shorter version of some of the topics here. And yes, you will see this exact slide using the old VMware format later on. So let's kind of dive into the meat of this topic, right? Why did I build a home lab, right? Why invest the time in it? Well, I've been doing this for almost 20 years. I started my first home lab back when I was in college, and it's kind of built up to where I am today. And this is first off, sorry for blinding everybody. I again used this in another presentation, and I didn't feel like trying to make it fit the new format, so we're just going to use the old VMware version of the slide. But I started the first one in 2003 when I was in college, and it's kind of carried with me throughout my career. And I'm going to talk about how this is kind of all shaped and fit my career, and how my lab and my career have evolved together. So my first home lab wasn't really a home lab, it was a dorm lab, right? And kind of set this up while I was in college. I think I might have been living off campus by that point in an apartment, but it was still college, and it was, a dorm room type scenario. I was in my third year of college. I was actually studying for a degree in IT, and this was in the early 2000s. I went to a small liberal arts college in Wisconsin. They had just started an IT program. It was part of their business program. So, like, a traditional liberal arts college, you have a lot of what they call the liberal arts core curriculum, which is like science and literature and history and all those things, along with a core of business courses, and then a core of IT or technology focused courses. Well, those technology courses were, and again, remember, this was the early 2000s when this was happening, but they were kind of basic. I had this, I really liked the classes that I was taking. I was learning a lot, but I always felt like there's a lot more under the cover here. And the classes I was taking and my teachers really couldn't like satiate that, desire to learn more and to go deeper. So I had an old desktop. I had actually built it when I started college 3 years earlier. It was like an old AMD Athlon 800 megahertz CPU. I don't even remember what the RAM was, but this was back in the day of like regular PCI bus PCs. Well, by that point, I wasn't using it as a desktop anymore. So I'm like, well, I'm going to turn this into a domain controller and a file server, and, install SQL on it and start using it as a server in my apartment, and just trying to learn more. So that's kind of how that lab started. There wasn't a lot to it, but it was just something to play with. Now, looking back, it sounds very basic. Oh, and by the way, yeah, AMD Athlon, right? Like, that's a name. Yeah, you probably haven't heard that in a long time. And, there's probably going to be a few more times where you're going to hear me say something like, wow, that's old. I haven't heard of that in forever, or I forgot that existed. But the early 2000s, when I started this, was a very different time, right? Like, a lot of the hardware that I had originally when I started college was built for Windows 98, right? It was desktop class hardware, was desktop class. Now, it was, very, I don't even know if I'd say the word was robust, but like there was a lot of change in that time in on the Windows side. So like the hardware that I had back then, 5 years later, wasn't really much. Servers, yeah, you had them, but they were loud and expensive and hard to get, and you didn't have these like resellers on eBay and electronics recyclers that would take the machines and refurbish them and try to resell them and make them available at a much lower cost than brand new. Actually, I think at that time people were still just chucking electronics in the garbage to get rid of them. And having a server is not something you'd want to have in an apartment, because I think about my modern servers that are next to my office, and it sounds like a jet engine when I turn them on, but those sounded like jet engines all the time. Now, at the time, virtualization was still kind of a new thing, right? I think VMware Workstation had been out by that point. ESX and GSX and some of those things were around, but they really weren't free. They weren't something that a college student would really know about or would be able to afford to run. So it was really like, I've got this hardware. I've got to use the hardware that I have. And it was a much different time too. There was no Reddit, there was no Stack Exchange or Twitter or a lot of blogs that you could use to learn from and tutorials to follow, right? If you wanted to learn outside of class, you were buying like books. And I remember having like some Cisco firewall books that were like literally like this thick that covered every single thing about the firewall up until the point that that book was published. And, you wanted a reference on something, that's what you were using. Now, one other thing that was different, back then, right? Microsoft basically gave away everything. Like if your school had an IT program, you could sign up for something called Microsoft Academic Alliance, and they'd send you CDs every month of Windows, Windows Server, SQL Server, Exchange, like anything you wanted, you got, and you got like actual license key stickers to go along with it. So it's like, oh, take that home and I'll throw Windows Server 2003 on this box that I have that I'm not using anymore, and we'll build a file server out of it, and we'll use that for to set up a domain and just kind of learn Active Directory inside and out, and then go to Barnes and Noble and buy a book and use that book as a reference as you're trying to do new things with it. So that's kind of right, like what I had to do at the time, just to kind of like meet that desire to learn more. And it's a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun to be honest, doing this, because everything was changing really quickly, right? Like every single processor generation was a huge jump from the last one. And like I built my desktop in 2000. It was a slot or socket A AMD Athlon. Within 4 years, they were coming out with 64-bit processors, and they were starting down the road to multi-core. And so it's like, and there were significant performance jumps every single release that made it noticeable. So that kind of carried me through college. And then I graduated in 2005. I'm not ashamed to admit that I was on the 5-year plan. And I got my first real jobs in 2006. And in those first couple of jobs, I went from, doing some database work to being a sysadmin at a couple of different places. And I was moving around, right? I was living in apartments close to where I worked. I was, in a serious relationship with the person or the woman who had become my wife. So, at some point I changed jobs to move to be closer to her, got married, had a kid on the way at this point. So there was a lot of change there. The early part of my lab, though, was very network focused, right? I had taken a role as a network admin for a local cookie factory, which was both a great learning experience and really bad on my diet. And I was doing a lot of network stuff, right? Like switch configuration and trying to understand all of that. And so I was focused more on learning Cisco. I had bought an ASA firewall to be my gateway and kind of learn that, and use Cisco switch or two. And so I was really just trying to get a handle on the networking aspect of IT. But then I switched jobs and I went to a place where they didn't need the networking so much. They were, pushing me down the Microsoft path. So I then switched gears and started doing Microsoft stuff. And at the same time, that's around the time ESXi Free came out. So, I was able to purchase an old machine from one of my employers as I moved. I was able to get that set up with ESXi Free and kind of start doing, more Microsoft certification focused stuff. Then I was able to get another old server from a different previous employer that they were retiring had no use for. And the lab kind of just started to grow slowly outwards from there. That AMD Athlon machine that I started on also kind of died in the process. And, it was time to let that go. Now, I still wasn't really big on home labbing at this point, right? It was there, it was nice. And it did help get some certifications. I think in the span of those 4 years, I knocked out like my MCSA, got an exchange certification. And then I switched jobs again. I was working nights as a sysadmin after my son was born. And I now had more time. I had started a blog to fill some of that time. Like I think in like 2010 is when I did actually my first blog post. And then I took a job where I got involved with a lot more VMware stuff and ended up doing a lot of well, at the time, VMware View. It was like VMware View 4.6 is the first version of that I used. And as I was doing that, I'm like, nobody has really done a lot with View. There weren't a lot of blog posts on it. And Derek Seaman had written a series of posts on vCenter and getting vCenter set up. And then I kind of looked at that and went, somebody should do something like that for View. And since, I said that to myself, I kind of volunteered myself and started blogging and kind of found my voice. And that also kind of led to me getting more involved in the community. So my lab there started to grow from kind of a Microsoft focused lab. I was running Exchange at home. I had an Active Directory to something that started to become a VDI lab. Now, running a VDI lab in the early 2010s was hard. It was really hard because there wasn't VMUG Advantage at the time. I wasn't a vExpert. And I was just kind of throwing this all together as I was trying to create this content. So this lab that I was building wasn't well architected. I was reacting more to problems than I was actually thinking about this like cohesively, right? Oh, I ran out of memory. Okay, let's find somebody on eBay to buy some memory from, to get that in. Oh, I need another host. So I'm just going to go on and try to find something very close to what I had. And this led to me making some expensive and short-lived mistakes. At one point, I had a Dell, it was a customized version of a Dell C6100. It was one of those that had it was a 2U box. It had like 4 sleds in it. This one was built for a cloud provider, so it wasn't even like the official Dell one, but it was a like a Dell custom computing solutions for some cloud provider, right? That lasted like all of a year, maybe a year and a half in my lab. Like I had tried some Cisco I think the C220s, like M2s. Those lasted a year. And so I was like making, changes rapidly, but I wasn't thinking about them from like a holistic perspective. Now, also at this time, Microsoft had the TechNet program. Who remembers TechNet Plus, right? Like you paid Microsoft $100 or $200 a year, kind of like VMUG Advantage, and you got all the stuff that you could. Like it wasn't quite as comprehensive as like an MSDN subscription, but you got like Windows Server, you got SQL Server, you got Windows desktop licensing, you got access to download the ISOs. And, that was great while it lasted. And, I think part of the problem was they also gave you Office with it, and those keys ended up on eBay. Well, as I'm doing this, right, as I'm building out this lab, the line between kind of the home network and the home lab started to get really blurry, right? Like my laptop was joined to my domain. The domain controller was providing DHCP and DNS services for the lab and the home network. So like you start to see kind of this cross blending of them, right? I go to do something in the lab, and there were many times where I reboot something and it took down things for my wife as she was trying to work on lesson plans for her job. So these are growing pains, as you know, as I was getting into home labbing. So I know there's some comments going on here in the lab, or in the chat here. So Brian asked, like, when you say old servers, do you mean full 2U rack mount boxes? More like the Tower ProLiants, right? In like early 2000s, like Tower ProLiants that were like Pentium 3 or maybe even Pentium 2. Like that's how old I'm talking about, in the early 2000s. So yeah, so this was all, the early phase of my lab, right? This is when I was actually building a lab and using it to, kind of the early days of creating content. Well, then in 2015, I jumped from being a customer to working at a partner. I got a job at a consulting firm based out of Chicago. And my lab became a lot more important at this point, because not only was I consulting, I was traveling. And I was getting more involved in influencer programs. I'd become a V expert. I was, being more active in VMUG and doing presentations at a bunch of different user groups. And I was starting to look at things like GPUs and VDI. So the lab really became a key part of my career development at this time. Then in late 2018, I jumped from being a consultant to working at VMware and doing EUC and cloud and DAS provider stuff. So all of these changes started to shift in how I thought about my lab and how I had to architect it. Because now I just wasn't, doing this for myself and trying to throw everything together into something that worked. I was going up in front of customers and, leading design workshops and making design recommendations. So it gave me an opportunity to, one, practice that architectural muscle and kind of thinking through designs, but also, it's like, this is starting to become critical to what I do, right? Because if I'm going to go and, test a customer use case, I want to make sure that, I'm actually able to test out parts of that customer use case before I go to that customer. And that led me to start doing things like trying to standardize my lab, right? Not just, I'm going to use Dell servers, but I'm going to buy servers that have these components in them. That way, and that they have the same processors across all of them. That way I don't run into issues with misconfigured EVC trying to vMotion things, or, have, failures where, I have to, try to find something old to replace it or whatever, right? It's like I wanted to kind of get that standard so that it was like what I would recommend to a customer. Even if it wasn't the latest and greatest, I still wanted that level of standardization. That also made it easier to manage, because this lab was growing, and it was growing at a fast rate, and I needed something that I could manage. And in one case, actually use somebody in my family as like remote hands when I was traveling and something broke, which did happen once, just before doing VMUG EUC Day in New York, and I think it was 2017. There was a tornado that went through about a mile from my house, and it wasn't a big tornado, but it did enough damage that I was getting on the plane as they were restoring power, and I needed my lab for a demo that the next day. So at 10 o'clock at night, I'm sitting in New York City, in a hotel room, talking to my wife, going, okay, now you got to press this, you got to do this, here's how you start this up for me. All right, now hook your phone up to your laptop. I'm going to use it as a hotspot and remote in through that, and we're going to get this going. And it was able to do it, right? But it was kind of one of those moments where, like, if I had just like a hodgepodge of things, that never would have worked. So those are kind of like the fun stories, right? That come with owning a lab and using it for for presentations and stuff. But despite my best intentions, right? Like my goal was always, we're going to segregate the home network from the home lab, right? It's going to stand on its own. Yeah, that never happened. That line that was blurry before just like completely disappeared. And as somebody said in the chat, right, it started to become home prod, and like started to rely on it more and more for just even basic things. So 2020 COVID hits, and all of a sudden, you know, all that traveling, being up in front of customers, right, that goes away, right? For like the first 6 to 8 months of 2020, like you're not testing customer use cases because customers are just trying to get stuff in the door, and cloud providers are just trying to add capacity, and they need something quick and dirty to meet the needs of the workforce at the time. So 2020 to 2021, I didn't really do much with my lab because one, I was busy. And then when that kind of all trailed off, I was burnt out. Like I didn't really want to touch this. So like the only thing I did in that time is I bought a 26U rack to put in my basement. I'll come back to this point in a little bit, but that arrived on a pallet. Yeah, there's some things about having stuff show up at your house on a pallet that, yeah, we'll come back to that. But then kind of worked through that burnout, like just played a lot of Pokemon for a year. And then one day I get a flyer on my door. A local telecom is coming through. They're like, we're going to put fiber in this area. Do you want to sign up? Like, well, hell yeah, I want fiber. And at the same time, a lot of VMware cloud provider partners were starting to talk about sovereign cloud, and they want to ask about it. Now, you might not think that these two areas come together very well, like, well, fiber in your home and sovereign cloud, like why would those both get you labbing again? Well, started to look at my lab and go, okay, well, if people are talking about sovereign cloud, they're going to want to talk about EUC in the context of sovereign cloud. They're going to want to be able to test out things. And it's not just going to be about EUC. It's going to be, well, how do I deliver all sorts of services? How do I deliver a sovereign cloud version of Microsoft or a Microsoft or Google Workspaces equivalent, or a OneDrive equivalent, or, you know, database as a service equivalent? So started thinking about, how do I architect my lab for that? How do I make it multi-tenant? How do I build out what a cloud provider would actually look like based on the conversations I've had? And that kind of overlapped with the fiber, because when my network at the time couldn't support gigabit internet, so I had to re-architect all that anyway. So I started focusing on networking again, and, you know, designing a virtualized network that could support gigabit internet and could support multi-tenancy in the confines of my basement. And yes, this is way overcomplicated, right? Most people wouldn't need to do this. Most people wouldn't talk about it, but it was very relevant to what I was doing at the time. So my thinking changed, right? The infrastructure just became infrastructure. It didn't matter what it was. I was more focused now on how to deliver services. And then I started building a new EUC lab. The old parts of my lab that I had used for 15 years were showing their age. It was a domain that had been upgraded and migrated from like server 2008 to server 2022. It was time to just kind of let that go and start fresh. Now, all of this thinking about how to deliver services, how to make the lab multi-tenant, and, you know, a change in, you know, the architecture for that made things really easy when last year I went, I think it's time to move off of VMware products as the core of my lab. And I did a large migration to Nutanix CE. And I'm really proud of this, because I actually sat down and treated it like I was an architect coming into a customer, did a workshop, wrote out the design, my proposed future state, and then was able to do the migration with very little downtime. And that downtime was really shutting off the servers so that I could have Nutanix Move migrate them. And I know Nutanix Move supports live migration, but I was more comfortable turning it off and doing that migration and taking the half hour, because at the when I was doing it, I was the only person on. Every kids were at school, wife was at work, didn't really impact anybody. So, but I was able to do that migration, and I was able to, get the bulk of my workloads from one platform to another. And it made me realize that when doing this, right, like the infrastructure underneath doesn't really matter. I mean, it didn't matter before as much, but I was very focused on, learning one platform because that's what my career was built around. And it's not that big of a deal to migrate. And yeah, again, that was also a really fun project. Took me about 3 months to complete, from the design to getting the underlying Nutanix CE cluster built up to completing that migration. But that as I look back on that, what really stands out to me is, well, not only is it relevant because that's a conversation a lot of customers are having, or a lot of organizations are having internally, but it's just getting to understand the tools of how to do it, and being able to just learn that whole process and learn what really matters, in that. And finding that the problem isn't migrating your workloads, it's everything else around it. I'm still cleaning up some of the things from that migration. Like I have Packer jobs that will run to build templates. I've had to re-architect or redo those to fit Nutanix now. Starting to look at infrastructure as code to replace PowerShell scripts that I had. Like those are the things that really matter when it comes to a migration, and not just like a home lab migration, but like an actual migration in an enterprise. It's everything around the infrastructure that's really important. So where that leaves me today is my use cases. And again, I'm sorry for the going from the black background to the white background. I didn't have time to convert this one to the new template, but like how I use my lab today, right? Like I'm still learning some advanced networking concepts, and how to, segregate things out, into different buckets and different fault domains. So I'm still learning BGP. I'm learning how to manage firewalling, on an internal scale, right? I'm using the lab to, it used to be try other VMware products, but now trying out a bunch of different EUC products that weren't in my wheelhouse when I was doing a lot of Horizon. Now I'm still doing Horizon, I'm still doing Workspace ONE type stuff, but now I'm also looking at things like Digen's Frame service, Chasm, and some other projects like that. Still doing a lot of work with APIs and automation. I talked about Packer. Now I'm also looking at Ansible and Terraform to do a lot of things that I used to be doing with a VM or a virtual appliance that used OVF properties for the configuration stuff. I do a lot of self-hosting of open source services. When I talk about service delivery, what kind of started me down that road was thinking about the sovereign cloud use case of, well, how would a cloud provider provide this service for a customer? And well, gee, I can do this too, using a lot of open source tools that are out there. And then finally, I still do a lot of Minecraft server hosting. That's kind of like the main use case for at least a fraction of my lab is, running Minecraft servers for my kids because that's what they want. So aside from Minecraft, some of the services that I'm running, I use a service called OwnCloud, which is kind of a self-hosted open source OneDrive or Google Drive alternative. There's a service called Mealy, which is kind of like a self-hosted allrecipes.com. It'll scrape a blog or a website and import the recipe for you. So instead of having to try to remember where you find all the recipes, you kind of have your own virtual cookbook. A new one I've started playing with is called Affine. It's basically an open source Miro alternative. Another one is Sterling PDF, which is kind of like if you take all the services or a lot of the services that something like Acrobat provides, it's kind of bundled up in a container, and you can run that in your lab. And then I also play some tabletop role-playing games. So I have my own instance of Foundry VTT that I host as a virtual tabletop for the games. Some of the things I'm looking at to add in, part of my goal here is to reduce my dependency on some of the cloud services that I was paying for, if not necessarily for me, at least for my family. So I'm looking at like a Google Workspace or Office 365 alternative, something like OnlyOffice or Collabora Online to run in my lab. Looking at Image or PhotoPrism for backing up photos off of our phones and tablets, so we don't have to pay for expensive iCloud subscriptions. I was doing some stuff with AI last year. And I'm going to get back into that, doing things like a self-hosted Ollama and a self-hosted Stable Diffusion alternative called Comfy UI. Now, these all run as containers and they present as a web interface. So, I did a little bit of this last year where I was running it on a server with a GPU, but I'm going to go back to doing that again once I finish with upgrading the server that it's in. But this is going to allow me to kind of run my own ChatGPT and run the ChatGPT alternative in my rack rather than have to run it locally on my machine. Then I can also, give that to my kids and kind of control, have them use it at home so they don't have to go out and use the public facing or the public versions of it. As I mentioned, right, like Chasm, Dision, some other EUC services. And then there's a new one I just came across. It's called Pangolin. It's an open source Cloudflare tunnels alternative. So I'm going to be looking at doing that as kind of like a site-to-site networking and a remote access option for my lab. And also Nebula, which is an open source overlay network that was developed by Slack. So those are kind of some of the things I'm looking at right now to get into my lab. All right, so over these 20 years, what are some of the critical success factors of having a lab that I've found? Well, the first one, obviously, is spouse acceptance factor, right? This is the major consideration for any sort of personal or home lab, right? Because like any hobby, right, you've got to invest in it. You're going to be paying for stuff, whether it's the hardware you use, the electric bill to run your servers or desktops, and software and subscription costs. Those are all really important budgetary items that you really do need to discuss. Now, there's other factors that go with this, right? Like what's the noise and the heat output, right? What's your space utilization? And if, like I mentioned earlier, right? Like early on in my career, I was living in apartments. Some of those apartments, were 2-bedroom apartments with really thin walls. Putting a server in there would not have been very kind to my neighbors. It wasn't until I got a basement that I was really able to invest time in this, because then I could just put everything out of sight. Then you also have to think about the impact to other things, right? Like how does having a home lab impact your home network? How does it impact accessing things like Netflix or YouTube or other things that Roblox or Minecraft or things like that? One of the things my wife really hates me for is that I have Pi-hole running and I have some very restrictive block lists. And I get more than one occasion where either my wife or my kids come to me and go, the internet's not working. And I look at it and go, no, the internet's working fine. This is just blocked. Let me know the site so I can go unblock it. But those kinds of things impact the acceptance of having a lab and running your own services in your house. Now, time is also a big consideration, because not only are you working, full time, or you're involved in other activities, you have family considerations that require time. Investing time in a lab takes time away from those other things. And so you have to be able to balance your time budget with that. Like when I was studying, back in 2010, 2011, my son had just been born. time that I wanted to study and work in the lab also conflicted with time that I needed to be watching my son at sometimes. Or, time that my wife needed to have a break from her job, which was watching other people's kids as a preschool teacher. So like there's always trade-offs that come with this, and you need to be willing and able to discuss these with your spouse or significant other before you buy anything or before you commit a significant amount of time. And I know the original version of this is, happy wife, happy life, but I prefer the happy spouse, happy house. Just as a reminder, right? You keep your family happy with your commitments, and they'll be more willing to accept your, having a home lab as a hobby. Now, if it arrives on a pallet, you probably should get permission, right? Because that's not a small thing that's coming to your house. And by probably, I mean definitely, right? Like if it's going to be something really big, if it's going to be something really expensive, it's something you need to talk about. And with your spouse, because you can't just have a giant thing show up on a pallet and then you have to figure out how to get it into the basement, because chances are they're going to have to help you. All right. So the final question you have to ask yourself is, what do I want to get out of my lab? Right? If you're going to commit the time, if you're going to commit the resources to doing it, you need to have a plan. You need to think through the outcomes that you want to deliver. Like, what's your learning outcome or learning objective? What is your time objective, right? But you want to focus on those outcomes, right? Don't just think, oh, I want to have a lab because it's cool, because yes, it is cool, but you should be, thinking about how that investment is going to pay off for you, right? Is it going to align with your career? Is it something you just want to learn for the heck of, or for the sake of learning it? So think about those considerations as you plan your lab or plan to expand your lab. So with that, yeah, I know you guys heard me talk for a long time here. So does anybody have any questions? Any comments that you want to add? The chat has kind of quieted down a little bit. So if there is something thoughts, things you want to share, feel free to come off a mute or just drop it in the chat.
Without getting too deep, you had a lot of solutions that are like private cloud, which is really cool for a home lab. But how do you juxtapose that with trying to replicate an enterprise environment? Because everything's going cloud-based. So in my mind, a home lab is one where I can do everything that I would be doing in the enterprise. Oh, I want to make sure I can do Azure Virtual Desktop or Intune and all those things.
Yeah. So, one thing I didn't touch on is cloud services. And I have my small fair share of them. This goes back to that kind of spouse acceptance factor thing of, cloud is expensive. Cloud is very expensive, especially on a home lab budget. So that's one of those things you need to go back and talk to your spouse about. Like if you specifically want to learn like something cloud first, like Azure Virtual Desktop, then you need to look at, well, what are my options for doing this cheap? How do I get Azure credits to fund this? Is it worth investing in a Microsoft 365 subscription that includes some of the services that my employer uses? Those are the kinds of things you need to think about. Like I have my own M365 tenant, that I've used for probably close to 10 years, and started because my employer was funding it because I was doing BYOD. So I got a stipend that helped cover some of that cost. And now it's a business expense, but those are the kinds of things that, like, if you want to like replicate an enterprise cloud environment, you really need to think about that from a cost first perspective, because once you start spinning up resources in Azure, right? Like to do AVD, you need to have a VNet, you need to have I believe an internet gateway. You're probably going to want Office 365, so you have that Intune subscription to be able to manage those desktops, right? Like you have to start thinking about, like here's what it's going to cost to deploy all those resources. For me, like if I were to do Horizon Cloud in Azure, right, I'd have to think about, what's the cost of the UAGs, what's the cost of the smart node and the load balancer and the Postgres instance and all those pieces that would have to be deployed to support that deployment. So yeah, it's to do that in a public cloud type scenario, it's really going to be cost focused first more than anything, because your employer has deeper pockets. Yeah. So yeah, and Callan just posted in chat, right? Cloud providers should offer industry professionals an option to stretch out, and do stuff in their lab, right? Something a little bit more than free tier, but maybe like a discounted rate and like a dev tenant. And I agree, that would be nice. But those clouds are also really expensive, and there's a lot of capex that they want to recover from that. So while it would be nice if they would do that, like I think the closest you would get is like an MSDN subscription that has like $50 a month in Azure credits, which, let's be honest, isn't a lot, especially for the price that you're paying for MSDN, but it's better than nothing. So does that answer your question, Brian?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay.
And then a follow-up on your home network. Did you ever go 10 gig networking?
Yes, I did. Okay. I didn't really talk about that, but I did go 10 gig on my back end when I was redoing it for the fiber to the home stuff. Prior to that, I had like a rat's nest of Cat5 cables with like multiple connections to each server to kind of spread the load and increase throughput. But yeah, when it came time to go, I'm going to get gigabit fiber, I probably should go 10 gig. And did that at that time.
Are you mostly DAC or Cat 6A, or what was your
fiber? I'm all DAC.
Okay.
And the reason I went DAC is because the Ubiquiti switches I bought were SFP plus, and the SFP plus cards for the Dell servers that I have were really cheap. Like I could buy it with that in there, and it was cheaper than getting 10 gig RJ45. Yeah. All right. So any other thoughts? Any other questions? All right. So if there aren't any other questions, I'm going to wrap this up with a couple of things. EUC World Amplify. It's the World of EUC conference. This year it's going to be in Minneapolis from August 4th to 7th. QR code on the screen will take you to the registration page. I highly recommend that you sign up to come. We've got 3 days worth of great content lined up, including at least a half day of unconference content where we can talk more about home labs and other EUC related content that you might be interested in. I believe the price right now is $150 per person, and I can't remember how long that price goes to, but I would definitely recommend signing up for EUC World Amplify. It's going to be a great time. All right. So the sponsors for EUC World Amplify, we have a premier founding sponsor in Liquidware, and then our founding sponsors, Tenzig, iGel, Nerdio, and Omnissa. Premier sponsors include Citrix and Stratadesk. And then we have Aporto, AWS, Dision, Google, Login BSI, and Parallels as our gold sponsors. Now, I'm calling this out, to help support our sponsors. And as a board member of World of EUC, I think it's important to thank our sponsors at every opportunity that we get. And that includes our founding partners for World of EUC, Tenzig, iGel, Goliath, Liquidware, Nerdio, Nutanix, Omnissa, and Choice Solutions. And then with that, I want to say thank you to everyone who joined today. Let's see if there's anything. Oh, Jen dropped the link in the chat, and the early bird pricing ends on April 30th. So thank you, Jen, for including that. And then, yeah, so thank you everyone for who joined today. If you have any questions, please, join the World of EUC Slack. There is a Home Labs channel on there where people can talk more about home labs. We also have a channel in there for home lab deals to talk about, hardware deals that people are finding to run in their lab. So with that, again, thank you everyone for joining today. Hope you have a great day and a great weekend.
Thanks, Sean. Great session.